Who is a refugee? A refugee is someone who has been forced to leave their home country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disasters. Examples of large refugee groups that have come to Vermont in the past are the Lost Boys, who fled civil war in southern Sudan, and the Somali Bantus, who fled civil war and persecution in Somalia. As this map indicates, Vermont is in the top 20% of states that is most welcoming to refugees, having received more than 68 people per 100,000 residents in the years 2013 and 14. Who lives in Vermont? Relative to the rest of the United States, Vermont has a population made up largely of white people. Based on the population of the United States as a whole, Vermont has fewer Asian people and far fewer Black and Hispanic people. Where do Vermonters come from? Vermont has a fairly low percentage of foreign-born residents compared to the United States as a whole. The majority of Vermont's foreign-born population comes from Europe, and not unlike the rest of the U.S., a large portion comes from Asian countries. Based on Vermont's geographic location, it is easy to understand why 19% of Vermont's foreign-born population comes from Canada, and only 10% comes from Mexico and other Latin American countries. When refugees are chosen to be resettled in Vermont, the state is responsible for the transportation to get them there. Once they arrive, families are given an initial $925 per person. Once this cash runs out, families may apply for financial assistance. Adults are expected to get a job within the first 6 months of their arrival. According to the Refugee Resettlement Program in Vermont, for the fiscal year 2014, 92% of the refugees the program took in were economically self-sufficient within the first 120 days of their arrival. Imagine being forced to leave your home country because of war or other extenuating circumstances and having to stay for an extended period of time in a refugee camp in a foreign country before hopefully having the opportunity to be resettled somewhere permanently. There are many struggles that people under these conditions face. One of the most obvious barriers facing refugees is language. There's a good chance that a family coming to Vermont from another country might have a hard time finding someone who speaks their language. For this reason and others, many refugees find themselves settling in areas where there are other refugees, such as Burlington and Winooski. Because of the large numbers of refugees and other immigrants in these towns, there is a better chance that a student here would get better resources for learning English than in a more rural and mainly white town, because these resources are already in place. Although, there is also a good chance that these areas are overwhelmed with the amount of ELL students they have. Winooski School District reports that 35% of their students receive English as a second language, or ELL, services. Their student population is made up of some 26 nationalities that speak 31 languages collectively. H.O. Wheeler is a small K-12 school in Burlington. Of its 230 students, half are foreign-born, and collectively they speak 30 languages. Standardized test scores have become the predictor for how well a student body is doing academically since the enactment of No Child Left Behind. Because of this, schools that have a high population of refugees or non-native English speakers tend to have lower test scores as a whole. As a 16-year-old Burlington High School student points out, quote, "Coming to America is hard enough. Sometimes a week later we are given a test to take in a language we don't understand," end quote. This poses a real problem because schools that don't meet the required test scores face the possibility of losing funding, which is much needed in said schools. More funding could help to close the achievement gap that these test scores help create. One problem noted by many non-native Burlington students who were recently interviewed by a local newspaper was the lack of representation of their culture in the classroom curriculum. Many said they felt left out. Recently, Burlington has created a diversity and equity mission statement that reads as follows. The mission of Burlington School District's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program is to actively include and value all students and to meet their unique learning needs while developing their understanding and respect of difference, thus preparing them to live in an inclusive global community and world. Misunderstandings between schools and families are bound to happen when there are students from differing backgrounds in the same class or school. An example of this misunderstanding comes from a local school. An Asian student came to class one day with red marks covering parts of his torso. Upon noticing this, the teacher, being a mandated reporter, reported what she saw to DCF. It was later determined that the family was using a practice called coining, an alternative medicine practice common in Asia, where hot oil is rubbed on the skin followed by harsh rubbing of coins in an effort to relieve things such as cold, cough, fever, and more. Ultimately, adding refugees to our schools is a positive thing. Native Vermonters get the opportunity to learn about and embrace other cultures, and refugees get the opportunity to get an education and become successful citizens.